The Sunday morning of December 7th, 1941 began the way most Sunday mornings in Hawaii began. Warm, still, the kind of quiet that makes a person believe the world is, on balance, a reasonable place. It wasn't. At 6 minutes to 8 in the morning, the first Japanese bomb fell on Ford Island. By the time it was over, 1 hour and 53 minutes later, 353 Japanese aircraft had come and gone in 2 waves, leaving behind them something that no photograph, no official report, and no subsequent congressional inquiry could fully describe: the complete humiliation of the United States Pacific Fleet. 8 battleships were sunk or badly damaged. 347 aircraft were destroyed, most of them still sitting in neat rows on the ground, wingtip to wingtip, arranged that way to guard against sabotage. The Navy had parked its planes in the most convenient possible formation for an air attack. 2,403 Americans died. Nearly 1,200 more were wounded. The entire catastrophe unfolded in the time it takes to watch a motion picture. There is a story about Admiral Husband Kimmel, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, that gets repeated because it is almost too stark to have been invented. He was standing at the window of his headquarters building when the attack began, watching his ships burn and sink in the harbour below. A spent machine gun bullet came through the glass and struck him in the chest. It left a bruise but did not penetrate. Kimmel picked it up, looked at it and said, and these are the words people remember: "It would have been merciful had it killed me." His career was already over. The bullet was just late. Within days, Kimmel was relieved of command. The country needed someone to hold responsible, and Kimmel was the man standing closest to the wreckage. History has been kinder to him since. The intelligence failures were institutional, spread across Washington and Honolulu, the product of bureaucratic friction and the fundamental difficulty of imagining an attack so audacious. But in December of 1941, none of that nuance was available. What was available was rage, and Kimmel absorbed it. Washington now faced a problem that had no comfortable solution. Someone had to take command of what remained of the Pacific Fleet. Someone had to stop the bleeding, restore some semblance of order, and prevent the Japanese from doing to the West Coast what they had just done to Hawaii. The question was who. The Navy worked through its list methodically. There were 28 admirals senior to the man who would eventually be chosen. 28 men with more rank, more time in grade, more of everything that normally determines promotion. One by one, they were considered and set aside. Not because they lacked talent, several were capable officers by any measure, but because each of them had in some way a fingerprint on the disaster. Each had been somewhere in the chain of command, had seen some piece of intelligence, had made some decision, or failed to make one. In the political atmosphere of December 1941, that was disqualifying. Franklin Roosevelt needed someone whose hands were clean. He needed someone who had not been there. The man he found was sitting at a desk in Washington processing paperwork. Chester William Nimitz was 56 years old, a rear admiral, and the chief of the Bureau of Navigation, the Navy's personnel office. By the standards of Washington's power structure, he was a backroom figure. He managed assignments, tracked promotions, handled the administrative machinery that kept the fleet staffed. He was not a man whose name appeared in newspaper headlines. He was not the kind of officer that junior men pointed to across a room and whispered about. He was from Fredericksburg, Texas, a small German-American community in the hill country, where his grandfather had run a hotel shaped like a steamboat. He had grown up without money, had gone to the Naval Academy because it was free, and had spent his career doing his work without making enemies. That last quality, in the winter of 1941, was worth more than any battle citation. He was a submariner by background, which was itself unusual for a Pacific command that would be defined by carrier aviation and surface warfare. His record contained one formal blemish. In 1908, as a young ensign, he had run a destroyer onto a mudbank in the Philippines. The Navy had court-martialed him, found him guilty of hazarding a vessel through inattention, and let him off with a reprimand. He had spent the next 33 years living it down. There was something else in his record, something that in retrospect looks like a narrow escape from history. 11 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor, in January of 1941, Roosevelt had offered Nimitz command of the Pacific Fleet. Nimitz had turned it down, He said he was too junior, that the appointment would cause resentment among officers who outranked him, that it would be bad for morale. He argued against his own promotion. That refusal saved him. Because the man who took the job instead, husband Kimmel, was now disgraced, his name associated permanently with the worst day in American naval history. And Nimitz, who had stepped back, who had said no, who had gone back to his desk and his paperwork, was now the only flag officer in Washington with seniority, competence, and no connection whatsoever to what had happened in Hawaii. Roosevelt chose him on December 17th, 10 days after the attack. He would be promoted to full Admiral, 4 stars, the highest rank, skipping several grades. The announcement was kept quiet. There was no press conference, no ceremony designed for public consumption. Roosevelt did not want the nation reading triumphant headlines about the man replacing a failure. The moment was too raw for that. What happened instead was this. Chester Nimitz boarded a commercial flight to California dressed in civilian clothes and wearing a hat pulled low. He did not want to be recognized. He was not, by temperament, a man who needed to be seen. Behind him in Washington, the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Ernest King, a man famous for his abrasiveness, a man of whom it was said he was so tough he shaved with a blowtorch, had already begun expressing his doubts. King had not been consulted on the appointment. He called Nimitz, in private, a desk admiral. He meant it as an insult. He meant to convey that Nimitz was a bureaucrat, a paper shuffler, a man of the filing cabinet rather than the bridge. King was wrong. But the Navy did not yet know that. What the Navy knew as Nimitz flew west across the country in his civilian suit was this: the Pacific Fleet was shattered. Japan had taken the Philippines, was closing on Singapore, had seized Guam and Wake Island, and was spreading across Southeast Asia with a momentum that seemed, in those first weeks, nearly impossible to check. The entire strategic architecture of American power in the Pacific had been built on the assumption that the battleship was the dominant weapon at sea. The battleship fleet was now sitting on the bottom of Pearl Harbor. Everything had to be rebuilt. Everything had to be reconsidered. And the man tasked with doing it was arriving by commercial aircraft, alone, in a borrowed hat, hoping no one would notice him. There is a particular kind of courage that gets no parades. It does not announce itself. It does not know in advance that it will succeed. It simply sits down at the table, looks at the wreckage, and begins to work. Chester Nimitz was about to introduce himself to Pearl Harbor. Chester Nimitz arrived at Pearl Harbor on Christmas Day, 1941. He landed in the early morning, and the first thing he saw was smoke. Not active fire. The attack had happened 18 days earlier, but the kind of slow, persistent haze that lingers above things that have recently burned and have not yet finished dying. The harbour smelled of oil and salt and something else underneath, something that everyone who was there that morning remembered for the rest of their lives, but rarely described in precise language. It was the smell of a catastrophe that had not yet been fully counted. The reception party waiting on the dock was formal, dress uniforms, the full ceremony of military protocol. Nimitz arrived in khakis. He had not changed into his formal whites. Some accounts say he simply hadn't had time. Others suggest it was deliberate, that he did not want his first appearance in Hawaii to look like a victory lap. Whatever the reason, the effect was the same. The new commander of the Pacific Fleet stepped off the boat looking like a man who had come to do work, not to be photographed doing it. He was given a tour. The officers escorting him had prepared for grief. They had watched their colleagues' faces cycle through shock and shame and simmering anger over the previous 3 weeks, and they expected the new admiral to move through those same stations. They pointed out the Arizona still burning, the Oklahoma capsized with her keel in the air, the West Virginia resting on the harbour floor with only her superstructure visible above the waterline. They explained the casualty figures. They described what the first wave had done and what the second wave had finished. Nimitz listened carefully. He asked questions, but not the questions they were expecting. He did not ask who had failed. He did not ask why the radar warning had been ignored, or why the torpedo nets were not deployed, or why the aircraft were parked wingtip to wingtip. Those were questions for investigators, for congressional committees, for the historians who would spend decades arguing over culpability. Nimitz asked different questions. He asked what was left. What was left, it turned out, was more than anyone in Washington had been willing to say out loud. The fuel. That was the first thing. Pearl Harbor held 4.5 million barrels of oil in above-ground storage tanks on the eastern side of the island. The Japanese had not touched them. Every commander who had walked this harbor in the preceding weeks had seen the sunken battleships and the burned aircraft and calculated destruction. Nimitz looked at the fuel tanks and calculated range. Without that oil, the Pacific Fleet could not operate at all, not for weeks, not for months. The Japanese had ignored it entirely. The attack had been surgically precise in some ways and incomprehensibly careless in others. The submarine base was intact. The repair docks and dry docks were operational. The machine shops, the ammunition stores, the supply infrastructure that any fighting fleet depends on, most of it was untouched. The Japanese had come to sink ships, and they had sunk ships, but the harbour itself, the industrial capacity to maintain, repair and sustain a fleet, was sitting there waiting to be used. And then there were the aircraft carriers. On December 7th, the Pacific Fleet had 3 carriers, the Enterprise, the Lexington and the Yorktown. None of them had been at Pearl Harbor when the bombs fell. The Enterprise was returning from Wake Island. The Lexington was ferrying aircraft to Midway. The Yorktown was in the Atlantic. By pure chance, the kind of chance that shapes history without asking permission, every one of the Navy's Pacific carriers had been elsewhere that morning. The Japanese had destroyed the battleship fleet. The battleship fleet was already obsolete, though almost no one in either Navy had fully accepted that yet. What they had left untouched was the carrier force, the weapon that would actually decide the Pacific War. It was, as Nimitz would say years later with characteristic understatement, a fortunate circumstance. He said something else on that Christmas morning, standing on the dock with the smell of burned oil still hanging in the air. The officers around him expected perhaps a speech about revenge. What they got instead was a single sentence. The Japanese made 3 mistakes. He did not enumerate them that morning. He was still counting. The first decision he made as commander was the one that surprised Washington most. He kept Kimmel's staff. Every instinct of institutional politics said otherwise. Kimmel was disgraced. His officers had been present for the disaster. The country wanted heads, and the Navy Department in Washington, particularly Admiral King, who had already decided Nimitz was the wrong choice anyway, expected the new commander to sweep the decks clean, bring in new people, start fresh. That was the visible, the politically legible thing to do. Nimitz did not do it. His reasoning was straightforward, and it was the reasoning of a man who understood the actual problem in front of him, rather than the political problem behind him. Kimmel's staff knew Hawaii. They knew the theatre, the geography, the logistics, the peculiarities of operating in the Central Pacific. They knew which supply lines worked and which didn't, which anchorages were reliable, which weather patterns disrupted operations. That knowledge had taken years to accumulate. Nimitz did not have years. He did not honestly have months. Japan was moving fast, and every week of institutional relearning was a week the enemy used to consolidate. He kept them. He told them plainly that the disaster was not their personal failure, that blame was a luxury he could not afford, and that he needed their best work immediately. Most of them, by all subsequent accounts, gave it to him. Washington was not pleased. Nimitz did not explain himself to Washington. He sent his reports, answered his cables, kept King informed, and continued doing what he had decided to do. This would become a pattern. Nimitz understood bureaucratic politics well enough to navigate them, but he was not governed by them. He was a man who had spent his career in administrative offices, and he had watched from that vantage point how many commanders made decisions designed primarily to protect their own reputations rather than to win. He was not going to do that. The basement was dark, always. It had no windows, and the men who worked there had stopped noticing the absence of sunlight sometime in the first week of December. Commander Joseph Rochefort ran the Combat Intelligence Unit out of a subterranean space beneath the 14th Naval District Headquarters building. His people called it the dungeon. It smelled of cigarette smoke and the specific kind of nervous exhaustion that comes from working on something you cannot quite solve. They were code breakers, mathematicians, linguists, former chess players, anyone who could hold a complex logical problem in their head for days at a time without losing their grip on it. They were working on JN-25, the Imperial Japanese Navy's operational code. It was not fully broken. It would never be fully broken. The Japanese changed their code books periodically, which meant that every few months the work had to begin largely from scratch. But it was partially broken, and partial in the intelligence business can be enough. Rochefort was an unusual figure. He wore a smoking jacket over his uniform in the dungeon, and slippers instead of shoes. He was brilliant in the way that makes institutional hierarchies nervous, not because he was difficult exactly, but because he was right in ways that people outranking him sometimes weren't, and he had not yet learned to disguise it convincingly. Washington's signals intelligence establishment, specifically the Naval Communications Office back in the capital, had a long-running bureaucratic argument with Rochefort's unit over methodology, and, underneath that, over credit. It was the kind of interagency friction that would have been mildly absurd under any circumstances and was genuinely dangerous under these ones. Nimitz visited the dungeon. He sat down with Rochefort. He listened. This was, by itself, unusual. Senior commanders did not routinely descend into basements to confer with the codebreakers. Intelligence was supposed to move upward through channels, get processed and summarized, and arrive on the Admiral's desk in a form that did not require him to understand how it was produced. Nimitz was not satisfied with that arrangement. He wanted to understand the uncertainty, which conclusions were solid, which were inferences, which were guesses that happened to fit the pattern. He wanted to know where Rochefort's confidence came from. He decided to trust him, not unconditionally. Nimitz was not a man who gave unconditional trust to anyone, but operationally. If Rochefort said something was happening, Nimitz would plan around it. Washington, meanwhile, was telling him to do otherwise. Through January and February and March of 1942, Japan took everything. Singapore fell in February, the largest surrender of British forces in history, nearly 85,000 soldiers. Burma followed. The Philippines were collapsing slowly and publicly, with General Douglas MacArthur's forces retreating down the Bataan Peninsula, while American newspapers printed maps showing the shrinking perimeter. The Dutch East Indies were gone. Wake Island was gone. The Japanese perimeter now stretched from the Central Pacific to the border of India, and it was still expanding. Nimitz could not stop any of this. He did not have the forces to stop it. What he could do, what Roosevelt was pressing him to do because the country needed to believe its navy still existed and still fought, was raid. Hit the edges, make noise, show the flag. The carrier raids of early 1942 were not militarily decisive. The strikes on the Marshall and Gilbert Islands in February, the attack on Wake, the Doolittle raid on Tokyo in April, none of them changed the strategic balance by any measurable quantity. What they did was something harder to quantify, but just as important. They told the Japanese that the Pacific Fleet had not ceased to exist, and they told the American public the same thing. They kept the war from feeling already lost. While the raids ran, Rochefort's people worked, and in the spring of 1942 they found something. The Japanese operational code kept referencing a target designated as AF. Rochefort believed AF was Midway Atoll, a small island roughly halfway between Hawaii and Japan, remote and nearly featureless, but sitting at a position of considerable strategic importance. If the Japanese took Midway, they had an airfield within range of Hawaii. Midway was the key to the whole Central Pacific. Washington disagreed. The analysts at Naval Communications in the capital thought AF was somewhere in the South Pacific, possibly near the Australian coast. The argument was not polite. Rochefort proposed a test. He suggested having Midway's garrison send a radio message, in a code the Americans knew the Japanese had cracked, reporting a freshwater distillation plant breakdown on the island. If the Japanese intercepted it and began reporting that AF had a freshwater problem, the question was settled. Midway sent the message. Within 48 hours, Japanese signals traffic was reporting that AF was experiencing a freshwater shortage. Nimitz had his answer. The target was Midway. The date was approximately the 4th of June. What Rochefort's intelligence told Nimitz was that the Japanese were coming with 4 fleet carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. 3 of those 4 ships had launched the aircraft that struck Pearl Harbor. All four together represented the core of Japanese naval air power in the Pacific. The Americans had 3 carriers. The Enterprise and the Hornet were available. The Yorktown had been damaged in the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May and was limping back to Pearl Harbor, trailing oil, with her flight deck torn and her inner compartments flooded. The Navy's own damage estimates said 90 days of repair work, minimum. 90 days was 67 days too many. Nimitz went to the dry dock personally. He walked through the Yorktown with the repair crews and the shipyard engineers. He listened to their assessments and then he told them what he needed. 72 hours, not 90 days, 3 days. They told him that was not possible. He told them to do it anyway. 1,400 dockyard workers went aboard the Yorktown in shifts, around the clock for 3 days. They welded and patched and pumped and sealed. They did not restore her to full fighting condition. They made her able to fight. On May 31st, the Yorktown sailed out of Pearl Harbor under her own power, her crew still working on repairs below decks while the ship moved. Nimitz watched her go from the dock. He had placed his entire hand on the table. If Rochefort was wrong about the target, if the Japanese came somewhere else or in greater strength than anticipated, the Pacific Fleet would lose 3 carriers, and the war in the Pacific would extend by years. There was no fallback, no reserve. This was everything. He did not look like a man gambling with the fate of a war. He looked, by most accounts, like a man who had thought the problem through and made a decision. Those are sometimes the same thing. The North Pacific in early June is cold and grey and indifferent to human urgency. The 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the patched-together Yorktown, reached their assigned position northeast of Midway on June 2, 1942. Nimitz had designated the coordinates Point Luck. The name was partly practical. The position offered the best angle for an ambush, and partly something else. An acknowledgement, perhaps, that everything from this point forward would require the kind of help that no admiral can manufacture from planning alone. They waited. The crews knew something large was coming, but not precisely what. The carrier captains had their orders. The fighter squadrons were briefed. The torpedo bomber pilots, young men, most of them, flying aircraft that were already edging toward obsolescence, had been told what to look for and what to do when they found it. Down at Midway itself, the island's garrison had been reinforced with every aircraft that could be scraped together from Hawaii. Army bombers, marine fighters, Navy patrol planes, a collection of machines as mismatched as the situation that had produced them. In the basement of the Fleet Intelligence Building back in Pearl Harbor, Rochefort's people were still working, pushing updated intercepts to the fleet as fast as they could decode them. 400 miles to the west and closing, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the Japanese striking force. He had 4 fleet carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. He believed he was sailing toward a weakly defended island and possibly 2 American carriers. He did not know about the Yorktown. He did not know that American codebreakers had been reading the margins of his plan for weeks. He did not know that 3 carriers were already waiting at Point Luck, positioned almost exactly where they needed to be. He was about to be surprised, but the surprise would not be clean, and the cost of it would not be small. The morning of June 4th began badly for the Americans. Midway-based aircraft attacked the Japanese fleet first, and the attacks failed almost completely. Army B-17 bombers flew high-altitude runs against ships that were maneuvering at speed below, a combination that had never worked and did not work now. Marine dive bombers and torpedo planes went in at lower altitude and were torn apart by Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Of the 41 Midway-based aircraft that attacked the Japanese carriers in the first hours, 14 were shot down and many more were badly damaged. Not a single bomb or torpedo found a Japanese ship. Nagumo, watching the attacks from the bridge of the Akagi, could have been forgiven for feeling confident. He made a decision. His second strike aircraft, loaded with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes designed for use against ships, needed to be rearmed with conventional bombs for another strike against Midway. The island's defences were clearly still functioning. Another attack was necessary before any amphibious landing could proceed. He gave the order. Below decks on all 4 carriers, the armament crews began the process of bringing up the anti-ship weapons, setting them aside in the hangar bays and replacing them with bombs. Hundreds of torpedoes and armor-piercing shells were temporarily stored on the hangar deck floors. The work was well underway when a scout plane report arrived. There were American surface ships to the northeast. Nagumo reversed his order, rearm for anti-ship attack, bring the torpedoes back up. The result was that his hangar decks were, at the precise worst moment, full of partially rearmed aircraft surrounded by unsecured ordnance that had been moved twice in the last 40 minutes. The American torpedo squadrons found the Japanese fleet shortly after 9 in the morning. Torpedo Squadron 8, flying from the Hornet, went in first. They flew obsolete TBD Devastators, slow, low, and nearly defenseless against a modern fighter. The Zero Combat Air Patrol came down on them immediately. Of 15 aircraft in Torpedo 8, 14 were shot down before they reached release point. Only one man from the entire squadron survived, clinging to wreckage in the Pacific for hours before rescue. His name was George Gay, and he floated in the water and watched the rest of the battle unfold from 3 miles away. Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise followed. They lost 10 of 14 aircraft. Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown came in from a different angle and fared slightly better, but not enough to matter in terms of damage. Of the 41 torpedo planes that attacked the Japanese fleet that morning, 35 were shot down, and not one of their torpedoes struck a Japanese ship. The sacrifice looked, in the moment, like pure catastrophe. It was not. The Zero fighters, scrambled in mass to destroy the torpedo bombers, had come down from altitude. They were fast and lethal, and they had done their job. But they were now at sea level, pursuing and finishing off the surviving Devastators, their guns burning through ammunition, their fuel state deteriorating. The combat air patrol that should have been circling high above the Japanese carriers to intercept diving attackers was not there anymore. At 14,000 feet, the American dive bomber squadrons arrived. 37 Douglas SBD Dauntless aircraft from the Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over an hour, flying past their calculated fuel point of no return. McCluskey had made a decision. Turn north, follow a Japanese destroyer he could see making wake below, and find the fleet the destroyer was certainly heading toward. It was the correct decision. It brought him over the Japanese carriers at the exact moment they were most vulnerable. He pushed over into his dive. What followed is remembered in the naval history of the Second World War as perhaps the most decisive 9 minutes of the entire Pacific conflict. McCluskey's 2 squadrons split, each taking a carrier. The Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, the ship that had launched the first wave against Pearl Harbor, took 2 bombs. One struck near the bridge, the other hit the amidships elevator, directly above the hangar deck full of rearmed and re-rearmed aircraft, unsecured torpedoes, and unguarded fuel lines. The secondary explosions began almost immediately. The Kaga, the second Japanese carrier, took 4 bombs in quick succession. Her flight deck erupted, her fuel system ruptured. She began to burn in the way that fully fueled carriers burn, comprehensively from multiple points at once, faster than any damage control party can respond. 17 dive bombers from the Yorktown, attacking separately, found the Soryu and put 3 bombs into her in a space of minutes. She was the smallest of the 4 Japanese carriers, and she had the least margin for damage. She went from fully operational to abandoned in less than 20 minutes. 3 Japanese fleet carriers, 3 of the 6 that had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, were mortally wounded within 9 minutes of the first American bomb falling. There was a 4th carrier. The Hiryu was still intact, separated slightly from the other 3, and her commander did not hesitate. 2 strike groups went out from Hiryu within the hour, and they found the Yorktown. The first attack put 3 bombs into her. The second put 2 torpedoes through her hull. The American damage control parties were extraordinary. They had the fires out and the ship underway between the 2 attacks, which is why the second wave's pilots, expecting to find a burning wreck, instead found a ship that appeared operational and went in again. In the end, the Yorktown took more punishment than any other carrier at Midway and stayed afloat longer than any of her Japanese counterparts. The Hiryu was found and bombed by aircraft from the Enterprise that afternoon. She burned through the night and sank the following morning. 4 Japanese fleet carriers sent to the bottom of the Pacific in a single day. Along with them, 248 aircraft, and the irreplaceable core of the Imperial Japanese Navy's trained carrier aviators. That last loss was the one that could not be replaced. Japan could build new carriers eventually. The men who knew how to fly from them, the same men who had trained for years to attack Pearl Harbor, the veterans of every Japanese carrier engagement from China to the Indian Ocean, most of them were gone. The Yorktown did not come home. She had survived the battle itself, listing but afloat, with a salvage crew still aboard working to keep her alive. A Japanese submarine found her the following day and put 2 more torpedoes into her. She sank early on the morning of June 7th, 3 days after the battle, taking down the destroyer Hammond that had been lashed alongside her. Nimitz received the news at Pearl Harbor. He issued no statement of triumph. He gave no speech to assembled officers about the significance of what had been accomplished. What he did instead was sit down at his desk and write letters to the families of men who had died, the torpedo squadron pilots, the dive bomber crews who had not made it back, the men on the Yorktown and the Hammond. Some of the letters were typed. Some, to the families of officers he had known personally, were handwritten. He wrote them systematically, one after another, until they were done. The battle had cost the United States 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 145 aircraft, and 307 men. The mathematics of exchange, 4 Japanese carriers for 1 American, looked decisive on paper. It was decisive. But the 307 men were not an abstraction, and Nimitz was not the kind of commander who treated them as one. The aftermath of Midway was not tidy. Victories rarely are. Joseph Rochefort, the man in the slippers and the smoking jacket who had argued with Washington about the target, and been proven correct in the most unambiguous way possible, did not receive the Distinguished Service Medal that Nimitz nominated him for. The bureaucratic war between his unit in Pearl Harbor and the Naval Communications Office in Washington had continued all through the battle, and Washington won it. In the autumn of 1942, Rochefort was removed from his command. The official explanation was vague. The actual explanation was that he had embarrassed people who outranked him by being right when they were wrong, and institutions have a long memory for that particular offence. He was assigned to command a floating dry dock in San Francisco. A man who had arguably done more to win the Battle of Midway than any other single individual spent the middle years of the Pacific War overseeing ship maintenance on the California coast. He never complained about it publicly. He died in 1976, and the Distinguished Service Medal Nimitz had tried to give him in 1942 was awarded posthumously in 1985, 43 years late. Nimitz went on. He commanded every major American naval operation in the Pacific from Midway to the end of the war. Guadalcanal, the island-hopping campaign up through the Central Pacific, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. He became Fleet Admiral, 5 stars, one of only 4 men in American history to hold that rank. He worked with MacArthur, which was not easy, and with King, which was not easy either, and with a rotating cast of subordinates, some of whom were brilliant and some of whom were difficult and some of whom were both. He made mistakes. He made fewer than most, and none of them were catastrophic, and he corrected them faster than most commanders would have. On September 2nd, 1945, aboard the battleship Missouri anchored in Tokyo Bay, Nimitz signed the Japanese Instrument of Surrender. He signed for the United States. Around him on the deck were representatives of every Allied nation that had fought in the Pacific. He signed with a fountain pen. He wore his dress whites. The ceremony took 23 minutes. He went home to California. He lived until 1966, 21 more years after the surrender, long enough to watch the world he had helped make become something neither he nor anyone else had fully anticipated. He fished. He walked his dogs. He gave occasional interviews to historians who wanted to understand what had happened and why. In one of those interviews, at some point in the quiet years after the war, he said something about Pearl Harbor that stopped the interviewer cold. He had been thinking about it for years, he said, working through the arithmetic of it. And he had arrived at a conclusion that sounded, on first hearing, like the statement of a man who had not understood what he was saying. He said Pearl Harbor was a blessing. He let that sit for a moment and then he explained. The Pacific Fleet, he said, was not built for the war it was about to fight. It was built around battleships, slow, heavily armoured, short-ranged. If the Japanese had come looking for the fleet in the open ocean, those ships would have gone down in deep water, miles from any harbour, beyond any possibility of salvage, and every man aboard them would have been lost with them. No one would have raised them from 4 miles of open ocean. But the Japanese had attacked in Pearl Harbor, shallow harbour. The average depth of the water where those ships sank was 40 feet. 6 of the 8 battleships that went to the bottom of Pearl Harbor were subsequently raised, repaired, and returned to service. Not in time for Midway, the carriers had already made battleships secondary by then, but in time for later Gulf, for shore bombardment during the island campaigns, for the final approach to Japan. The ship that Kimmel had watched sinking from his window on December the 7th was sailing again before the war ended. And the carriers, the ships that would actually win the Pacific War, had been at sea that morning, untouched, ready. The Japanese had attacked the wrong weapons with the wrong weapons in the wrong place, and had, by doing so, handed their enemy the precise conditions under which they could be beaten. Nimitz had thought about this for years. The attack that destroyed his predecessor's career and handed him command of a shattered fleet had also, inadvertently, cleared the way for everything that followed. History does not often arrange itself this neatly, and when it does, the neat arrangement is usually visible only afterward, from a distance measured in decades. He did not say this made it worth it. He did not say the 2,403 men who died on December 7th had died for a reason, because that is not a thing that anyone who has written condolence letters by hand tends to say. He said it was a fact. He said it was a fact that he had sat with for a long time before he was willing to say it out loud. The interviewer, by most accounts, did not know how to respond to that. Nimitz picked up his coffee cup, or his glass, or whatever was on the table in front of him, and changed the subject. Some men are made by catastrophe. Not because catastrophe is good, but because it removes everything that was obscuring them, the bureaucracy, the seniority lists, the politics of peacetime promotion, and leaves only the problem and the person willing to solve it. Chester Nimitz spent the first 56 years of his life preparing, without knowing he was preparing, for the worst moment in American naval history. He was the right man in the right place because every wrong thing had happened first. That is not a comfort. It is just the truth,